In the first video in this series, I was talking about what Christ is and whether Christianity as a religion and Christians individually recognize what Christ is. And I was saying that when you look at the scriptures, you can actually see that Jesus did not present himself as being the only Son of God or being a person who was the Christ in the fullness of what the Christ is. And what I was arguing in the first video is that Christ is actually a universal state of consciousness that is beyond any one person or any one institution that we human beings can create here on earth. And let's take that thought a little bit, right? What is salvation? Most Christians that I've met have never even really thought about it. They think about it, you will go into heaven and you're going to be happy ever after. And I've even met Christians who think that life in heaven is going to be almost like earth, just a little bit better here and there. Even some Christians believe that we need physical bodies in heaven. Our current physical body is going to be resurrected, and we're going to live on in heaven with these physical bodies. We're going to eat, drink, and be merry. But that's not really what Jesus was saying if you read the scriptures. Because Jesus was presenting salvation as something very different from the state of life, the state of consciousness that most people have. You just think about the story where there's a young man who comes to Jesus and says, I would like to follow you, but my father just died. Would you please let me go and bury him first? And what does Jesus say to him? He says, let the dead bury their dead. Well, think about that quote. What was Jesus saying? Was he saying that corpses are running around burying other corpses? No. So there must be some symbolic, metaphorical meaning here. Namely, that the people, most people in the world are in a state of consciousness where they are dead from the perspective of the Christ mind. As in the previous video, I read from the Gospel of John, in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. All things were made through Him, and without Him nothing was made that was made. In Him was life, and the life was the light of men. So in other words, if we take my thought from the previous video, that Christ really is beyond any one person or beyond any one institution, it's a universal state of consciousness that ties us together with our Creator, then we can say, there is only life in the Christ consciousness. Meaning that those who have lost their connection to the Christ mind are spiritually dead. Now they are still, from an outer viewpoint, completely alive. The man's father had died and the family were getting ready to bury him. But what Jesus was saying to this young man who wanted to follow Christ was, don't be loyal to these people who haven't recognized Christ because they're spiritually dead. Let them bury their dead, and you come and follow Christ. And so when we begin to realize this, we realize that recognizing Christ isn't quite that simple. Following Christ isn't quite that simple. It requires us to really rethink. And if we grew up in a Christian culture, it actually requires us to be willing to rethink the beliefs we were brought up with. Just as people 2,000 years ago who had grown up in a Jewish culture had to rethink their beliefs in order to follow Jesus when he walked in the flesh. And so what we have here is that when you look at this, Jesus actually presented a view of life, a view of people that I haven't heard any Christian church ever explain. And it's this. People can be in two fundamentally different states of consciousness. You can be spiritually alive or spiritually dead. And the only way to be spiritually alive is to recognize Christ. Which means what? Well, if you're spiritually dead, what are people doing? They were the ones who, remember, rejected Christ. Because in their minds they were so attached to their outer doctrines and rituals and beliefs and worldview. And Jesus didn't conform to the Jewish worldview. So therefore they rejected the living Christ when he stood before them. And why was that? Well, as I said last time, Jesus says to Peter, when Peter says, "Thou art the Son of God," the Christ, the Son of the living God, "Blessed art thou, Simon Bar-Jonah, for flesh and blood has not revealed it unto thee, but my Father which is in heaven." In other words, Peter had recognized that there was something special about Jesus because Jesus was the open door for the universal Christ consciousness to be expressed through him. And Peter recognized that, as did his other disciples. So what we can say is that those who had not recognized Christ as being something beyond their own state of mind, they are spiritually dead. And why do people not recognize Christ? Well, because they are so attached to their outer beliefs, which could be the belief that if they belong to the right outer religion and follow all of its rituals, they are guaranteed to be saved. But Jesus was saying these people are spiritually dead. They are not going to make it into the kingdom unless they open themselves to the Christ mind, because only in the Christ mind is their life. Otherwise, you're spiritually dead. Okay, so this quote, "Blessed art thou, Simon Bar-Jonah, for flesh and blood has not revealed it unto thee, but my Father which is in heaven." And then the next verse, "And I say also unto thee, that thou art Peter, and upon this rock will I build my church, and the gates of hell shall not prevail against it." Well, this, of course, is what the Catholic Church has taken and used basically as the justification for their entire existence. That Jesus was saying to Peter that he was so special. He was the rock. He, the outer person of Peter, was the rock upon which he would build his church. The Catholic Church, because they say that because Peter traveled to Rome and was crucified in Rome, he was the first pope. Now please find me the word pope in the New Testament. I've looked for it. You can too. Now, what the Catholic Church does, as I said, they take these two verses, and this is the entire foundation for their existence and their claim that they are the only church that represents Christ. But what they usually leave out are the verses that follow shortly afterwards. So here is Matthew chapter 16, verse 21. "From that time forth began Jesus to show unto his disciples how that he must go unto Jerusalem and suffer many things of the elders and the chief priests and scribes, and be killed, and be raised again the third day. Then Peter took him and began to rebuke him, saying, Be it far from thee, Lord, this shall not be unto thee. But he turned and said unto Peter, Get thee behind me, Satan. Thou art an offense unto me, for thou savorest not the things that be of God, but the things that be of men." Was Jesus schizophrenic? First he says, Peter, you are the church upon which I'll build my church. And then later he says, Get thee behind me, Satan. In other words, he's deliberately saying, either he's saying that Peter was Satan, or there must be some interpretation that most Christians have overlooked. So is it possible, as I said, that Christ can't be confined to just one person? Is it possible that Satan can't be confined to one person? Is it possible that the way Jesus talked about Satan was precisely this, the consciousness that closes your mind to Christ, and therefore shuts you off from the source of life, spiritual life? And what is that consciousness? Precisely what I've been talking about. we take the outer mind and we define an image of what the world is like. And now we can even, by using this state of mind, we can even come to believe that this image that we have created here on earth, separated from Christ, that this image portrays how the world really is. Even that this image that we have created here on earth, based on separation from the Christ mind, this can define what Christ is. This can define what God is. This can define how to be saved. You see what I'm implying here? If you really read between the lines of what Jesus was saying, he was rebuking Peter. And why? Well, here are the two things. Thou art Peter, and upon this rock will I build my church. Flesh and blood has not revealed it unto thee, but my Father which is in heaven. So in other words, first you have Peter, who's using his ability, that ability we all have, to recognize Christ in Jesus. That Jesus has attained something that Peter hasn't attained. And what is it Jesus has attained? A higher degree of oneness with the universal Christ mind. In other words, Jesus is not the exclusive Christ, but Jesus is an example of a person who has attained oneness with the universal Christ mind. That's why he is the open door that no man can shut. The universal Christ mind was expressing itself through Jesus. And Peter recognized that what was coming through Jesus was not coming from the human level, from the state of spiritual death, from the consciousness of separation from Christ. It was coming from a higher reality. That's what Peter recognized in the first quote. But in the second quote, now Jesus is telling his disciples, I'm going to be crucified and killed. And Peter now falls away from his recognition of that the Christ is beyond his own mind, and he uses his own expectations that Jesus is going to be like the King, the Messiah, and he's going to be recognized by everybody, and he's not going to be humiliated in this way. He uses that outer mind to say to Jesus, oh no, Jesus, you don't even know what you're talking about. This is not going to happen to you. Your life is going to follow my expectations, not what you are saying. So first Peter is recognizing that Jesus has something Peter doesn't have. But then in the second quote, Peter is now using what is in his own mind, his own expectations, to project that he knows better than Jesus what's going to happen to Jesus. And that's why Jesus turns around, says to Peter, get thee behind me, Satan. Thou art an offense to me, because thou savorest not the things that be of God, but the things that be of men. The things that be of men, the interpretations, the doctrines, the beliefs, the worldview that human beings have created. So, you see what is happening here, what Jesus is actually doing? He is saying, most people need to be saved because they have descended, fallen into a state of consciousness where they have lost contact with the universal Christ mind. They are not open to any influx in their own mind of the universal Christ mind. They are in a state of mind of spiritual death. Now, in a way, you could say that once people have sunk into this state of mind, it can be a somewhat innocent state of mind, in the sense that they just don't know that the Christ is there. They have forgotten that there is something called the Christ. So this is not necessarily Satan, what Jesus means with Satan. It's just what he means, what he calls spiritual death, that the dead bury their dead. Well, what is Satan then? Well, as I said, the Christ mind is meant to secure unity between the Creator and its creation, meaning us, who are self-aware beings, who have the ability to choose. And this means that when we have descended into this state of spiritual death, the only way to get out of it is through the Christ mind. But how is the Christ mind going to help us get out of it? By challenging the beliefs, the doctrines, the worldview that we have created based on the consciousness of separation and death. You see, the Christ is the unifying element. We have lost contact with the Christ mind. Therefore, we are in a state of spiritual death. But it doesn't mean we are unconscious. So what are we doing? We are using our outer minds to define a worldview. And why? Because we have a need for security. That's why, as I said in the first video, people at the time of Jesus believed that salvation came through the outer church. So in other words, just by being a member of the outer religion and following all of its rituals, you were guaranteed to be saved. Look at most Christians today. What do they think? If you really ask yourself what most Christians think, they believe that they have a contract with God. That if they do these outer things, following all the outer rituals, believe in all the outer things, then Jesus is contractually obligated that when they die, he has to show up and save them. Even if they haven't changed their state of consciousness, even if they have not been willing to look at the beam in their own eye, even if they're still focusing on the splinter of their brothers and predict, oh, these people won't be saved because they're not members of our church. Why did Jesus call Peter Satan? Because Peter had taken the images that he had created from the consciousness of death, and he was now projecting them onto Christ. So, as I said, Peter had first recognized, he had used the ability we all have to recognize Christ as something beyond our own mind. But now, instead of allowing Jesus to continually pull him beyond his own mind and his own worldview, he was now attempting to take his own worldview of what should or shouldn't happen to Jesus and pull Christ into it. And therefore, make Christ validate the worldview that was created out of the mind of Antichrist. Peter was attempting to make Christ validate a worldview created from the mind of Antichrist. Think about this. Think about this, the ramifications of this. And what Jesus was saying was, you have the consciousness of death, which is ignorance. That's one thing. But taking the worldview that you have created out of ignorance and projecting upon Christ, who comes to pull you out of ignorance, so that you are attempting to make Christ validate the worldview created from ignorance. This very tendency, this very psychology, this is what Jesus called Satan. It's not a person. It's not a man with hoofed feet and a tail and long horns. It is a specific state of consciousness that instead of allowing Christ to continue to pull you beyond the consciousness of death, you want to pull Christ into the consciousness of death and make him validate it. And that is precisely what the Catholic Church did in 325 and 381. When they created the exact same kind of religion as the religion that had Jesus physically killed as a symbol for killing the Christ. The Jewish religion killed Christ physically. The Catholic religion killed Christ in the minds of all people who believe in him, and all Christian churches who follow after the Christian religion, even if they claim they're different, but if they hadn't gone back and looked at what the Catholic Church did, they too are killing Christ. They are in the consciousness of Satan, claiming that Jesus Christ as a physical person was the only Son of God and the only representatives of God. That is taking a man-made image and trying to pull Christ into validating that man-made image. And that man-made image comes from the consciousness of Antichrist. And that's why I say the Christian religion, starting with the Catholic Church, is satanic, because it's based on a fundamental denial of Christ. Now again, I'm not asking you to believe me. I am asking you to consider, are you willing to go within your own heart, go into a neutral state of mind, and ask Christ or ask Jesus to show you, is there something to this? Ask yourself the question from a neutral state of mind. What is Christ? What is Satan?